After 48 days, lost cat crawls, home with last bit of strength, barely alive. What truly fuels the will to survive against impossible odds? You might think Whiskers, the cat's 48-day journey back to Martha, was just instinct. But brace yourself for a shocking twist hidden within those lost weeks that reveals what really kept him going. Subscribe, like, and listen now to uncover the full, heart-wrenching story of the 48-day return. The world was a roaring, freezing chaos of brown water and debris. Claws scrabbled uselessly against slick, submerged bark as the current ripped and tore, pulling him under again. Water forced its way into his nose and mouth, a suffocating pressure that stole the air from his burning lungs. Panic, cold, and absolute seized him. He was tumbling weightless and powerless, slammed against unseen obstacles hidden in the churning flood. One moment, the blurry rain-lashed sky; the next, suffocating darkness. His small body was a vessel tossed on an angry, uncaring sea that had once been a familiar field brook. The sound was deafening. The roar of the water, the crack of branches snapping nearby, the relentless drumming of rain. Where was up? Where was solid ground? Instinct screamed danger flight, but there was nowhere to flee, only the relentless, violent motion of the flood. Then a brutal impact. His side exploded in pain as he was thrown against something hard and unyielding, perhaps a submerged fence post or a large rock. The shock jolted a choked gasp from him. He flailed, desperate, feeling his strength rapidly fading. The cold seeped into his bones, a lethargy creeping through his limbs, whispering surrender. Was this it? This torrent? This terrifying noise? This crushing cold? Was this the end of everything? Suddenly, his paws snagged on something softer, tangling in a mesh of roots and mud near the edge of the churning water. The current still pulled, trying to reclaim him, but the anchor held. With a surge of adrenaline born of sheer terror, he hauled himself forward, inch by painful inch claws, digging into the sodden earth. He dragged his battered body onto a small muddy embankment, collapsing into the mire. He lay there shuddering uncontrollably, ribs aching with every shallow breath. Mud caked his fur, water streamed from his coat, and the world still spun around him. He was alive somehow, but the roaring water nearby was a constant threat. He lifted his head, weakly blinking mud from his eyes. Through the driving rain, he saw nothing familiar. Towering, unfamiliar trees dripped onto desolate, flooded fields under a bruised and angry sky. He was lost, terribly, utterly lost, and the comforting scent of home, the scent of her, was completely gone, washed away by the deluge. A low, miserable sound escaped his throat, swallowed immediately by the ongoing storm. He was alone, injured, and adrift in a terrifyingly vast and hostile world. Just 2 days prior, that world had been predictable, safe, and centered entirely around the gentle routines of Martha Jenkins' small clapboard house on the outskirts of Oak Haven, Illinois. Martha, a widow whose quiet life had settled into a comfortable rhythm over her 70 years, found solace and unwavering companionship in Whiskers. He wasn't just a cat. He was a furry, silver-gray shadow with startlingly deep blue eyes, a silent confidant who had shared her home and heart for 15 years. His presence was woven into the fabric of her days, the soft weight on the end of her bed at night, the gentle rumble of his purr beside her armchair, the expectant meow at the kitchen door precisely at feeding time. Whiskers, old by cat standards, still possessed a quiet dignity. His once sleek fur, now slightly thinner, still shone like polished pewter. in the afternoon sun slanting through the living room window. His movements were slower, more deliberate, his leaps onto furniture calculated rather than impulsive. He spent most of his days dozing in sunbeams, occasionally patrolling the small fenced backyard, or supervising Martha's gardening efforts from the porch railing. He was a creature of habit, deeply attached to the familiar scents, sounds, and sensations of his territory. The storm had arrived with unexpected ferocity on the evening of the second day before his watery ordeal. It wasn't just rain. It was a malevolent force, shaking the old house with cannonades of thunder that vibrated through the floorboards. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the lashing trees in stark, terrifying flashes. Whiskers, like many animals, held a deep-seated fear of thunderstorms. Normally, he'd seek refuge under Martha's bed, a quivering ball of fur, until the noise subsided. But this storm was different. A particularly violent clap of thunder, seemingly right overhead, coincided with a powerful gust of wind rattling the back door. Perhaps the latch, old and worn, hadn't caught properly. Perhaps the wind itself forced it ajar. In that split second of blinding light and deafening noise, Whisker's ingrained instinct screamed louder than his fear-induced paralysis escape. He bolted a silver streak against the dark wood floor, squeezing through the narrow opening the wind had created in the back door. He didn't mean to go far, just to put distance between himself and the terrifying noise inside the house. He sought the relative quiet under the dense lilac bushes at the edge of the yard. But the storm outside was worse. Rain plastered his fur to his skin in moments. Wind howled through the branches, making the familiar bushes seem alien and menacing. Disoriented and soaked, he tried to dart back towards the house, but another lightning flash illuminated the landscape, making him flinch and veer away deeper into the yard's edge where the fence met overgrown woods. He huddled there, shivering, waiting for a lull that never came. The inciting incident wasn't a single moment, but a dawning, terrifying realization as the storm raged through the night and into the next day. When the rain finally lessened slightly, he tried to navigate back, but the familiar scents were washed away or masked by the overwhelming smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. The landscape itself seemed altered by the downpour. Streams had become torrents. Familiar paths were muddy mires. He'd wandered further than he thought in his panic, driven by the storm's noise. He was outside his known territory, the invisible boundaries of scent and sight that defined his world. The house, Martha's safety, they were lost to him, obscured by the storm's aftermath and his own disorientation. Back in the small house, Martha woke the next morning to an unsettling silence. No furry weight on her feet, no expectant meow from the kitchen. A cold dread seeped into her heart as she noticed the back door slightly ajar, swinging gently in the post-storm breeze. Whiskers. Her voice trembled. She searched the house, her calls growing more frantic. She checked under the bushes, her heart sinking with every empty space. By midday, the flyers were printed her handwriting. Shaky, lost cat Whiskers, 15 years old, silver gray blue eyes, beloved pet. Please call Martha. She trudged through the muddy town, tacking them to telephone poles and store windows, each stapled notice a prayer sent out into the damp, indifferent air. Hope, fragile from the start, began to fray with every passing hour. Whiskers was not just lost. He was old frightened, and somewhere out in the sodden, storm-ravaged landscape. The world, stripped of familiarity, became a relentless series of challenges for Whiskers. His first instinct after the initial shock of the flood subsided was simply to hide. He found temporary refuge under a dense canopy of rain-heavy pines, the thick layer of needles offering a slightly drier, safer place than the open mud. Hunger, a dull ache at first, quickly sharpened into a demanding, clawing sensation in his belly. Accustomed to predictable meals served in a clean bowl, the concept of hunting felt alien, a rusty instinct buried under years of domesticity. He tried, driven by desperation. He stalked a field mouse rustling in the undergrowth, but his movements were clumsy, his pounce too slow. The mouse vanished into the dense grass. He lapped dew from leaves and drank cautiously from muddy puddles, the unfamiliar taste coating his tongue. He investigated overturned garbage cans near isolated farmhouses, finding only repellent smells and disappointment. Once he managed to corner a large beetle, consuming it with a grimace. It barely blunted the edge of his hunger. Days bled into one another, marked only by the cycle of damp dawns and cold nights. He learned to fear the sounds of barking dogs, quickly scrambling up trees or squeezing into tight crevices when their menacing calls echoed nearby. He encountered a large feral tomcat near an abandoned barn, all muscle and menace, who chased him off with terrifying hisses and a swipe that left a stinging scratch on his ear. He learned to avoid open spaces during daylight, sticking to the edges of woods, the cover of tall grass, the shadows beneath dilapidated farm equipment. The physical toll was relentless. The rich, silver-gray fur became matted with mud, burrs, and filth. His paws grew sore and cracked from the constant dampness and rough terrain. He lost weight rapidly. His ribs became prominent beneath his thinning coat, his spine a sharp ridge. The elegant creature Martha knew was becoming gaunt, feral, a shadow of his former self. Yet beneath the misery, a primal drive persisted. It wasn't a conscious thought of Martha or home, but a deep, instinctual pull, a faint olfactory thread he sometimes caught on the wind. The smell of the Oakhaven Creek, perhaps, or the specific mix of pollens from the fields closer to town that urged him vaguely eastward. He learned to cross roads freezing at the terrifying roar of approaching vehicles darting across the asphalt. Only when the vibrations faded. He navigated by landmarks he didn't understand consciously, but seemed to recognize instinctively: a particular stand of oak trees, the curve of a distant hill, the glint of the sun off the town's water tower, barely visible on the horizon. On clearer days, there were small moments of bleak respite. He found a discarded, half-eaten sandwich near a picnic area, a feast that gave him energy for another day. He discovered a leaky faucet dripping into a mossy patch behind a disused gas station, providing clean water for a precious hour. Once a child tried to approach him, hand outstretched, but years of comfortable domesticity couldn't overcome the ingrained fear of the unfamiliar that his ordeal had instilled. He darted away, vanishing under a porch. Meanwhile, Martha's life in Oakhaven had become a hollow echo. She maintained the routines, putting out food and fresh water on the back porch twice a day, scanning the yard, hopefully every time she opened the door. But the silence in the house was deafening. Her neighbors offered sympathy. Head shakes, stories of cats gone missing who never returned. She visited the local animal shelter weekly, her heart leaping painfully at every gray cat, only to sink again when it wasn't Whiskers. The flyers, soaked and peeling, remained tacked to poles, monuments to her dwindling hope. She spoke to Whisker's empty cushion by the fire, telling him about her day tears, sometimes tracing paths down her cheeks. The bond wasn't broken, but stretched thin and taut by absence and the growing unspoken fear that she would never see her companion again. Weeks passed. The initial frantic search gave way to a dull, persistent ache of loss. She started packing away his favorite toys, the small catnip mice he loved to bat around the act itself, feeling like a betrayal. Whiskers, driven by the inexplicable urge, pushed onward. He skirted the edges of small settlements, the sounds and smells of humans, both a repellent danger and a faint magnetic pull. He faced new threats. A swooping hawk he narrowly avoided by diving into thorny brambles, the acrid smell of pesticides in a sprayed field that made him retch and forced a detour. His journey was a solitary battle against starvation exposure and the constant gnawing fear of the unknown, fueled only by the faintest instinctual whisper of home. He was weaker, slower, but still moving one painful step after another across a landscape that remained stubbornly unfamiliar. The ordeal reached a new low point near the end of the 4th week. Whiskers had managed to find shelter from a chilling autumn rain inside a dilapidated wooden shed on the edge of what looked like an abandoned farmstead. The shed was musty, filled with decaying sacks and rusted tools, but it was dry. He huddled in a dark corner, licking futilely at his matted fur, the persistent ache in his belly now a constant companion. His injured ear throbbed, and a newer wound, a deep scratch on his hind leg from the encounter with the thorny brambles while escaping the hawk, felt hot and tight. Infection was setting in. He was weak, profoundly weak. The effort to even stand was becoming immense. For 2 days, he barely moved from the relative safety of the shed, conserving what little energy he had left. He drifted in and out of a hazy state, not quite sleep, not quite wakefulness. The drive to move the instinctual pull eastward seemed to fade, overshadowed by pain, exhaustion, and hunger. Despair, cold and heavy, settled over him. He had traveled so far, endured so much, but perhaps this was it. This dark, damp corner would be his final resting place. He closed his eyes, a low rattle in his chest, accompanying each shallow breath. On the 3rd morning in the shed, something shifted. A change in the wind brought a new collection of scents, drifting through the gaps in the warped wooden planks. Beneath the dominant smells of damp earth, decaying wood, and his own misery, there was something else, faint, almost imperceptible, but achingly familiar. It wasn't just the general scent of the Oak Haven area this time. It was more specific. The faint, unique aroma of the massive ancient oak tree that stood in Martha's backyard, the subtle hint of wood smoke from her chimney. Even though it was autumn, she sometimes lit a small fire in the evenings. And beneath it, all the faintest, most precious trace of Martha herself, the scent of her laundry soap, her rose-scented hand cream, the unique smell of his human. It was like a key turning in a rusty lock deep within his feline brain. The hazy lethargy receded, replaced by a jolt of recognition, a resurgence of purpose. Home wasn't just an abstract direction anymore. It felt tangible, almost within reach, carried on the breeze. This wasn't just random survival. It was a return with a surge of effort that sent waves of pain through his injured leg. Whiskers struggled to his feet. He was unsteady, skeletal, a pitiable sight, but his blue eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, held a renewed spark. He pushed his way out of the shed, ignoring the stiffness in his limbs, the throbbing in his leg. He tested the wind, turning his head, slowly pinpointing the direction of the familiar sense, east, slightly southeast. This was the turning point. His journey shifted from a desperate, often directionless struggle for survival against overwhelming odds to a focused, determined push towards a known destination. He was no longer just reacting to the dangers and deprivations of the wild. He was actively navigating, driven by a specific instinctual goal reinforced by the tangible promise of familiar sense. He knew with a certainty that resonated deeper than conscious thought which way he needed to go. The landscape ahead was still fraught with peril. He was still weak, injured, and vulnerable. But now there was a crucial difference. He wasn't just lost anymore, he was going home. He limped out from the shadow of the abandoned farmstead, ignoring the pain, ignoring the gnawing hunger. For a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon in the direction the wind had indicated. The final, most difficult phase of his journey was about to begin, but now it had a clear, unwavering purpose. He moved with a new, albeit shaky resolve, putting the relative safety of the shed behind him, drawn inexorably towards the faint, life-affirming scent of Martha, and the only home he had ever known. The point of no return had been crossed not physically, but mentally. Surrender was no longer an option. The renewed sense of purpose warred constantly with Whisker's deteriorating physical state. The final stretch of his journey, perhaps only 5 or 6 miles as the crow flies, but an immense distance for a creature in his condition, was the most brutal. The familiar sense grew stronger, tantalizingly close, yet the obstacles seemed to multiply, magnified by his profound weakness. He was now navigating the fringes of Oak Haven itself. This meant more roads, busier roads with cars that sped by with terrifying frequency and noise. He learned to wait sometimes for long, agonizing minutes, hidden in roadside ditches, choked with weeds, before finding a gap large enough to dart across. Each crossing stole precious energy, leaving him trembling and breathless on the other side. Residential neighborhoods presented new dangers. Barking dogs erupted from seemingly every yard, forcing him into desperate scrambles under hedges or up fences he could barely scale. He encountered other cats, territorial and aggressive, who saw his weakened state as an invitation to attack. He avoided conflict whenever possible, hissing weakly and retreating, conserving the last dregs of his strength. Food remained a constant, desperate need. His hunting skills hadn't improved. He was simply too slow, too weak. He relied on scavenging, finding scraps in overflowing bins the night before, trash pickup licking spilled soda from the pavement, chewing on discarded crusts. It wasn't enough. His body continued to consume itself. His fur hung loose on his skeletal frame, patchy and dull. His eyes, once bright blue, were sunken and often clouded with discharge. The infection in his leg persisted, making every step a painful effort. He limped heavily, favoring the limb, sometimes dragging it uselessly. Rain returned, not the violent deluge of the initial storm, but a cold, persistent drizzle that soaked him to the bone and lowered his body temperature dangerously. He sought shelter wherever he could find it. Under the dense foliage of ornamental shrubs in someone's garden, beneath parked cars in the crawl space under a porch, always moving on as soon as the rain eased or danger threatened. He was operating almost purely on instinct now. The familiar scents were his compass, pulling him forward, yard by yard, street by street. He recognized the smell of the creek that ran through the town park, the scent of the bakery 3 blocks from Martha's house, the specific aroma of the pine trees lining her street. These olfactory landmarks guided him even as his vision blurred with exhaustion and his mind felt foggy. Then came the 47th night. As dusk bled into a cold, starless night, the weather took a vicious turn. A late autumn storm, mirroring the one that had started his ordeal, rolled in with unexpected fury. Wind howled, driving sheets of rain horizontally. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the ground, dredging up the primal fear he'd felt weeks ago. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, terrifying flashes, revealing slick streets, thrashing trees, and the familiar silhouette of Martha's Street just ahead. This was his dark night of the soul. He was agonizingly close, perhaps only a few hundred yards away, but the storm was a physical barrier. The wind threatened to knock him off his paws. The rain chilled him to the core, stealing the last vestiges of his body heat. He stumbled through the mud pooling in a neighbor's flower bed, his legs trembling violently. He could barely see through the deluge, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He collapsed right there by the base of the familiar old oak tree in the adjacent yard, the one whose scent had reignited his hope weeks ago. He simply couldn't move anymore. The cold, the wet, the exhaustion, the pain, it all converged into an overwhelming wave of defeat. He lay curled in a tight ball against the rough bark, shivering uncontrollably, the roar of the storm filling his ears. The scent of home was strong here, so strong, but it felt impossibly far away. Was this how it ended? After everything to perish just yards from safety? He closed his eyes, a low moan lost in the wind. But as the storm raged, something flickered deep inside, not thought, not reason, but the tenacious spark of life, the unwavering homing instinct that had driven him across miles and weeks. He could smell her Martha's safety warmth. With an effort that seemed to tear at his very muscles, he lifted his head. Through the sheeting rain he saw it, the dim warm glow of the porch light on Martha's house. It was an anchor in the chaos. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to move again, not walking, barely crawling. He dragged his wrecked body through the mud across the sodden lawn separating the yards. Each movement was torture. His injured leg left a smear in the mud. He pulled himself forward with his front paws, inch by painful inch. The fence. He had to get past the low picket fence, separating the properties. He squeezed through a familiar gap at the bottom, tearing fur, scraping skin, but not stopping Martha's yard. He was in Martha's yard. The scent was overwhelming now. He reached the bottom step of the back porch. He tried to climb, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He collapsed again, this time on the weathered wood of the porch itself, right below the door. He lay there pressed against the familiar wood, the storm raging around him. The rain plastered his thin fur to his skeletal frame, and shivers racked his tiny body. He was soaked, freezing, and utterly spent. Yet the proximity of the door, the overpowering scent of home that seeped through the threshold, fueled one final desperate act. He had no strength left to meow. The sound lost somewhere in his raw throat. Instead, summoning the very last dregs of his energy, he lifted a front paw. His claws, worn and broken from weeks of travel, scraped weakly against the bottom of the wooden door. It was a faint sound, barely audible above the howl of the wind and the drumming of the rain. Scritch, scratch. A pause as he gathered another ounce of will scratch. It was the sound he used to make when he wanted in, though usually much louder, more insistent. Now it was a ghost of that sound, a pathetic plea against the elements. Inside, Martha Jenkins sat in her armchair, a half-finished cup of tea, cooling beside her, the storm rattling the window panes. 48 days, 48. Empty, quiet days since Whiskers had vanished. She had almost given up hope, the ache in her chest settling into a permanent dull sorrow. She was reading, or trying to, the words blurring on the page as the wind moaned outside. Then she heard it, or thought she did. A tiny scratching noise at the back door, almost lost in the storm's fury. She paused, listening intently. Probably just a branch blown against the house, she told herself, or the wind itself. But there it was again. Scritch, scratch, faint, desperate it sounded, impossibly like Whiskers. Her heart leaped into her throat. No, it couldn't be. Not after all this time, not in this storm. It was wishful thinking, her grief playing tricks on her ears. But the sound, weak as it was, persisted for a moment longer. She stood up, her legs trembling slightly, apprehension warring with a sudden wild surge of hope. She walked slowly towards the back door, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. Hesitantly, she reached for the doorknob, her breath catching in her chest. She turned the knob and pulled the door open just a crack, peering out into the dark, rain-lashed night. And there he was. At first, she almost didn't recognize him. A small, shivering heap of mud-caked fur huddled on the porch, looking more like a drowned rat than the sleek companion she remembered. He was skeletal, his bones starkly outlined beneath the sodden coat. His face was gaunt, his eyes barely open, slits. But then those eyes opened a fraction wider, and even through the grime and exhaustion, she saw the unmistakable deep blue. It was him, Whiskers. The name was a choked whisper, thick with disbelief and overwhelming emotion. He lifted his head weakly at the sound of her voice, a tiny, almost inaudible rumble starting deep in his chest. A purr, impossibly weak, yet undeniably there. The sight of him so broken, yet undeniably there broke through Martha's shock. Tears streamed down her face, hot against her cold cheeks, mingling with the raindrops blowing onto the porch. Oh, Whiskers, oh, my dear boy, you're home. You came home. She knelt carefully on the wet porch, heedless of the cold and damp, her hands hovering over him for a moment, almost afraid to touch his fragile form. Gently, ever so gently, she scooped him up. He weighed almost nothing. She could feel every ridge of his spine, every protruding bone through the sodden fur. He offered no resistance, simply collapsing against her chest, the weak purr vibrating faintly against her coat. Clutching him protectively, Martha backed into the warmth and light of the kitchen, quickly shutting the door against the storm. She carried him immediately to the old soft towel she kept near the hearth, laying him down carefully upon it. He shivered violently, his small body radiating cold. Martha rushed to grab more towels, gently dabbing at the mud and water, trying to warm him without rubbing his sore skin. She murmured to him constantly, her voice thick with tears and relief, telling him he was safe, he was home, he was such a good, brave boy. She knew better than to offer him rich food immediately. She warmed some low-sodium chicken broth, diluting it further with warm water, and offered it to him spoonful by spoonful. He lacked the strength to lap from a bowl, but he managed to lick weakly at the spoon, swallowing small amounts. His eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, remained fixed on her face. After a few sips, he mustered the energy to lift his head slightly and lick her finger, a gesture of profound trust and connection that made fresh tears spring to Martha's eyes. The next morning, wrapped securely in blankets, Whiskers made the trip to the veterinarian. The diagnosis was grim but hopeful. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, hypothermia, multiple scrapes and bruises, and a localized infection in his leg wound, but crucially, no irreparable internal injuries. He was, the vet said, marveling, incredibly tough and incredibly lucky. Treatment began immediately. Fluids, antibiotics, careful nutritional support. News of Whiskers' miraculous return spread quickly through Oakhaven. Neighbors stopped by, initially hesitant, then amazed, bringing small offerings: a can of special recovery cat food, a soft new blanket. The story warmed the small town, a testament to endurance and the deep, unspoken bond between a lonely woman and her devoted companion. Whiskers' recovery was slow. He spent weeks mostly sleeping, eating tiny meals, gradually regaining strength. He remained wary of loud noises and sudden movements. The trauma of his journey etched into his psyche. He never regained all his lost weight, remaining leaner than before, and the fur on his leg grew back slightly patchy around the scar. But his blue eyes regained their clarity. His purr grew stronger day by day, and he once again sought out sunbeams and the comforting presence of Martha. Their new normal was quieter perhaps, but deeper. Martha watched him with a fierce, protective love, her gratitude immense. Whiskers rarely strayed far from her side, content with the safety and warmth of home. He was a living, breathing miracle on her hearthrug, a silver-gray reminder that even after the harshest storms and the longest, darkest journeys, love and determination could sometimes find their way home.
Dramatic rescue. Miracle happens to a dying ginger cat and her adorable kittens. Could a dying mother cat and her helpless newborns, hidden and fading fast in an overgrown garden, possibly be found before it's too late? Their dramatic rescue is a race against time, but the truly shocking twist is the fragile mother cat's incredible display of will after being saved, fighting impossible odds to nurture her babies in a heartwarming miracle nobody expected. Subscribe, like, and listen to this breathtaking story of survival and compassion. The air beneath the old, sprawling rhododendron bush was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and a faint, metallic tang of recent birth, overlaid with the sharper scent of growing sickness. For Clementine, a young ginger tabby cat barely more than a year old herself, this hidden hollow had become both a sanctuary and a prison. Driven by the primal urge to find a safe, secluded place to deliver her first litter, she had burrowed deep into the tangled branches at the back of a large, overgrown garden near a dilapidated wooden shed whose paint peeled like sunburnt skin. It had seemed perfect at first, shielded from view, protected from the spring rains by the dense canopy of waxy leaves, but perfection was fleeting. The birth had been difficult, longer than instinct told her it should be, leaving her utterly exhausted. 4 tiny kittens, miniatures of herself in varying shades of orange, cream, and buff, now nestled blindly against her belly, their fragile lives dependent entirely on her dwindling resources. The problem was, Her resources were dwindling alarmingly fast. In the days following the birth, a fever had taken hold, likely an infection born from the difficult labor and the damp, unsanitary conditions. It left her weak, shivering despite the humid air, and plagued by a thirst that raged against her depleting body fluids. Worse, the fever stole her appetite and curdled the little milk she produced. Her kittens, nuzzling frantically, latched onto nipples that offered little sustenance, their tiny mews growing weaker, more distressed with each passing hour. Clementine knew, with a mother's desperate certainty, that she needed help. She needed food, water, warmth that didn't come from a fevered body. But leaving her kittens, even for a short foraging trip, felt impossible. They were too small, too vulnerable. Any predator, a neighborhood dog, a raccoon, even a large rat, could snatch them in moments. And her own weakness was profound. The short distance back to the edge of the garden, where she might find a puddle or perhaps scavenge near the house, felt like miles. So she stayed, curled tightly around her babies, offering what little warmth and comfort she could. She licked them weakly, trying to stimulate them, trying to clean them, her rough tongue sluggish, her movements heavy with lethargy. Occasionally, a stronger wave of instinct would surge through her, and she'd lift her head, peering through the tangled leaves with clouded green eyes, letting out a soft, plaintive cry for help that was barely louder than the rustle of the wind. But no help came. The world outside her hidden den remained indifferent. The property belonged to Mrs. Helen Dubois, a woman in her late 70s who had lived in the large, slightly imposing house since she was a bride. Since her husband George passed away several years ago, the extensive gardens, once his pride and joy, had gradually slipped beyond her ability to manage alone. She kept the front lawn tidy and tended the rose bushes near the porch, but the back acreage, sloping down towards a wooded creek, grew wilder each year. The rhododendron bush, planted by George decades ago, was now a massive, tangled entity near the equally neglected garden shed. Helen rarely ventured back that far anymore. The memories it stirred were too poignant, the physical effort too demanding. Inside the dim, humid space beneath the leaves, Clementine felt herself fading. The fever burned, the weakness deepened, the desperate cries of her kittens grew fainter as their own small energies waned. She licked one tiny, still form, then another, her movements becoming agonizingly slow. Darkness pressed at the edges of her vision. She had tried her best, fought her instincts to flee and stayed to protect, but it wasn't enough. Without intervention, without a miracle, the small lives entrusted to her, and her own, would soon be extinguished in the shadows of the overgrown garden. Mike Callahan didn't mind yard work, especially on sprawling old properties like Mrs. Dubois'. It offered a satisfying rhythm, a tangible sense of accomplishment, and it paid reasonably well, helping supplement his fluctuating income as a freelance handyman. Helen Dubois had hired him for a major spring cleanup, trimming overgrown shrubs, clearing winter debris, tackling the wilder sections near the back of her property that hadn't seen proper attention in years. He started near the house, methodically working his way back with shears, a rake, and occasionally the noisy roar of the leaf blower. By the second afternoon, he was approaching the neglected area near the old garden shed, dominated by the enormous, almost menacing rhododendron bush. The air here was still, heavy with the scent of damp soil and foliage. As he paused to wipe sweat from his brow, taking a swig of water from his canteen, he thought he heard something, a faint, high-pitched sound, like insects buzzing, or maybe distant kittens. He glanced around, saw nothing, shrugged, and went back to raking leaves into a large pile. Probably just cicadas tuning up early, he figured. Later that day, while wrestling with a particularly stubborn patch of ivy near the shed's foundation, he heard it again. This time it seemed clearer, less insect-like, more plaintive. A series of tiny, weak squeaks, almost on the edge of hearing. He stopped again, listening intently. The sounds were intermittent, easily lost in the rustle of leaves or the chatter of birds overhead. He peered towards the dense mass of the rhododendron but couldn't see anything unusual. "Probably field mice," he muttered, though it didn't sound quite right for mice either. Still, the property backed onto woods. Small creatures were to be expected. He finished his work for the day and headed home, the faint, puzzling sounds forgotten amidst thoughts of dinner and resting his aching back. The next morning, however, the sounds returned. Mike was using hand clippers to trim back some of the lower dead branches of the rhododendron, trying to create a clearer path to the shed. The air was unusually still, the usual morning bird chorus momentarily quiet. And there it was again, a tiny mew, weak but distinct, followed by another, even fainter. This time he was certain. It wasn't insects, wasn't mice. It sounded like kittens, very young kittens, and they sounded distressed. He crouched down, trying to pinpoint the source. The sounds seemed to be coming from deep within the base of the massive bush, near the ground. He called out softly, "Hey, kitty, anyone in there?" There was no response. Only another heartbreakingly weak mewl a few moments later. Concern began to replace curiosity. Kittens hidden deep in a bush weren't necessarily unusual, but these sounded exceptionally weak. Where was the mother? Usually, a mother cat would respond protectively if someone approached her litter, or at least be visible coming and going. He scanned the area around the bush and the shed again. No sign of an adult cat. He continued his work, but his unease grew. Every time he heard another faint cry, it tugged at him. Finally, around lunchtime, he decided he needed to mention it to Mrs. Dubois. He found her on the back porch, reading a book. "Mrs. Dubois," he began, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Sorry to bother you, but I think you might have kittens under that big rhododendron bush back by the shed." Helen looked up, adjusting her glasses. "Kittens? Oh dear. Are you sure, Mike?" Pretty sure, ma'am. I've been hearing them on and off since yesterday. Very faint sounds, like newborns, but they sound awfully weak, and I haven't seen any sign of a mother cat around." Helen frowned, concerned about creasing her kindly face. She knew stray cats sometimes passed through her property, drawn by the shelter of the overgrown areas. Newborns? Without a mother? Oh, that's not good. She remembered a ginger cat she'd seen lurking near the woods a few weeks back, looking heavily pregnant. Could it be her? "Maybe the mother's just out hunting," Mike suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Perhaps," Helen conceded, "but if they sound weak, maybe we should take a closer look. Could you manage to peek under there without disturbing things too much?" Mike nodded. "I can try. It's pretty thick, but I can try to part the lower branches a bit." He headed back towards the rhododendron, Helen following slowly behind him, her steps hesitant on the uneven ground. The faint mewling sounds seemed to have stopped, adding to their worry. Mike knelt beside the bush, took a deep breath, and began carefully pushing aside the dense, leafy lower branches, peering into the dim, tangled space beneath. The damp, slightly fetid smell hit him first, then his eyes adjusted to the shadows. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. This was far worse than just unattended kittens. The space beneath the ancient rhododendron was a small, dark hollow, floored with damp, packed earth and years of accumulated leaf litter. As Mike's eyes adjusted, the scene resolved itself with heartbreaking clarity. Curled in the deepest shadow was an orange tabby cat, her fur dull and matted, her body alarmingly thin and still. She was lying on her side, breathing in shallow, almost imperceptible gasps. Nestled against her belly, seeking warmth that wasn't truly there, were 4 tiny kittens. 3 were shades of orange and buff. 1 was a darker tabby pattern. They were squirming feebly, their faint mews barely audible now, little more than tiny squeaks of fading life. The mother cat, Clementine, didn't react to the sudden intrusion of light or the looming presence of the human. Her eyes were half closed, filmed over with a dull glaze. One tiny paw lay limply across the smallest kitten, a final instinctual gesture of protection offered by a body that had almost nothing left to give. It was devastatingly clear she was dying, and if she died, the kittens, unable to regulate their own temperature or find nourishment, would follow within hours. "Oh, my Lord," Mike breathed, recoiling slightly. He felt a wave of shock and deep pity wash over him. He'd seen stray animals before, even sick ones, but the sheer desperation of this scene, the dying mother, the helpless newborns, struck him to the core. "What is it, Mike? What do you see?" Helen called anxiously from behind him, unable to peer into the low space herself. Mike straightened up slowly, his face grim. "It's bad, Mrs. Dubois. Real bad. The mother cat's in there with 4 little ones, but she's..." She's barely alive, ma'am. Looks like she's starving, maybe sick. The kittens are newborns, and they don't look good either. Helen's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with distress. Oh, the poor things. The poor, poor things. What can we do? Mike ran a hand through his hair, thinking quickly. We need to get them out of there right away, especially the kittens. Get them warm and see if they can take some milk replacer. But the mama, I don't know if she can be moved safely, and she might fight if we try to take the babies. Even in her weakened state, maternal instinct could be fierce. We can't just leave them, Helen insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Is there anyone we can call? Animal control? Mike considered. Animal control might take time, and their resources were often stretched thin, especially for critical medical cases like this. Maybe, he said, but I know a lady, Lisa Hartman. She runs that small rescue group, Creek Critter Care. Works miracles with bottle babies and sick strays. If anyone can handle this, she can. She's got incubators, feeding tubes, the whole 9 yards. Yes, call her immediately, Helen urged, relief flickering in her eyes. Tell her it's an emergency. Mike quickly pulled out his phone, found Lisa's number. He'd called her once before about an injured raccoon, and explained the situation rapidly. Lisa, it's Mike Callahan, working at Mrs. Dubois' place off River Road. Found a mama cat under a big bush, looks near death, got 4 newborns with her, fading fast. Need help, critical. Lisa's response was immediate and professional. Okay, Mike. Don't try to move the mother yet if she's barely conscious. Just focus on keeping the kittens from getting chilled if you can do it safely. I'm grabbing my emergency kit and incubator. I can be there in 15-20 minutes max. Keep them as undisturbed as possible until I arrive. 15 minutes felt like an eternity. Mike knelt near the bush again, peering in occasionally. Clementine hadn't moved. Her breathing seemed even shallower. The kitten's weak cries had almost ceased. Helen hovered nearby, wringing her hands, murmuring prayers under her breath. The fate of this small, fragile family hung precariously in the balance, dependent now on the swift arrival of help and the slim hope that it wasn't already too late. The glimmer of hope Lisa's call offered felt terribly fragile against the gloom beneath the rhododendron. Lisa Hartman arrived not in 15 minutes but 12, her battered but well-equipped van pulling quickly into Helen's driveway. She was a woman in her late 40s, practical and calm on the surface, but with eyes that held both deep compassion and the weary knowledge of countless animal emergencies. She hopped out carrying a large carrier, a thermal blanket, and a bag filled with medical supplies, greeting Mike and Helen with a brisk nod. Okay, show me where they are, she said, her voice calm but conveying urgency. Mike led her quickly back to the rhododendron bush. Lisa knelt down, using a small flashlight to peer into the dim hollow. She took in the scene swiftly, the nearly comatose mother, the listless kittens, the damp conditions. Mother's severely dehydrated, hypothermic, possibly septic, she assessed quietly. Kittens are fading fast. We need to move very carefully but very quickly. Her first priority was the kittens. Their tiny bodies couldn't regulate temperature and were losing heat rapidly. Mike, can you gently reach in and lift the kittens out one by one? Place them straight into this carrier. I've got a warming disc in there. Mike nodded, steeling himself. He slowly reached under the bush again. Clementine didn't react as he gently disengaged the first tiny kitten from her side. It felt terrifyingly light, barely moving. He placed it carefully into the waiting carrier. He repeated the process 3 more times, his large, work-roughened hands surprisingly gentle. The kittens huddled together on the warming disc inside the carrier, emitting only the faintest of squeaks. Now came the hardest part, moving Clementine. Lisa approached cautiously. "Easy, Mama," she murmured soothingly. "We're going to help you. Just relax." Clementine's eyes flickered slightly at the sound of her voice, but she made no move. Lisa gently felt her limbs, her belly. "She's incredibly weak, barely responsive." Using the thermal blanket, Lisa carefully slid it underneath the frail cat. Working together, she and Mike gently maneuvered the blanket until Clementine was fully supported on it. Then, slowly, smoothly, they lifted her out from under the bush and into the daylight. She looked even worse now, emaciated, her fur patchy, her breathing shallow and ragged. Helen gasped softly, tears welling in her eyes again. "Okay, let's get them straight to my place," Lisa directed, already moving towards her van with the carrier of kittens, while Mike carefully carried Clementine on the blanket. "I have an incubator and fluids set up. Call the vet to see if he can meet me there or advise over the phone." The drive to Lisa's small house, which doubled as her rescue headquarters, was tense. Lisa focused on driving swiftly but smoothly, while Mike sat in the back, monitoring Clementine wrapped in the blanket on the seat beside him, ensuring her airway remained clear. Helen followed in her own car, praying silently. At Lisa's house, the race against time intensified. The kittens were placed immediately into a pre-warmed incubator. Lisa quickly assessed them. All were underweight, dehydrated, and chilled. She began the laborious process of trying to tube feed them tiny amounts of kitten milk replacer, KMR, as they were too weak to suckle from a bottle. It was painstaking work, requiring immense care not to aspirate the fragile newborns. Meanwhile, Clementine was placed on a heating pad, covered with blankets. Lisa, after a quick consultation with her vet over the phone, administered subcutaneous fluids to combat the severe dehydration. The vet suspected puerperal fever, postpartum infection, complicated by starvation. He prescribed antibiotics, which Lisa carefully administered via injection, along with supportive B vitamins. Clementine remained largely unresponsive, her life hanging by the slenderest of threads. Helen and Mike watched, feeling helpless but wanting to offer support. Lisa worked with focused intensity, moving between the mother and the kittens, cleaning, warming, feeding, medicating. It's touch and go for all of them, she admitted grimly during a brief pause. Especially the mother. Kittens this young without proper nursing. Their chances aren't good even when healthy, and these little ones are already compromised. All we can do now is provide supportive care and hope. The small room filled with the hum of the incubator, the faint squeaks of the kittens, and the tense silence of hoping for a miracle. Hours crawled by. Lisa continued the cycle of care, warming fluids, attempting feedings, monitoring vital signs. There were no dramatic improvements, but crucially, neither Clementine nor the kittens seemed to decline further in those initial critical hours. They were holding on, barely, clinging to life against overwhelming odds. The dramatic rescue phase was over. The long, uncertain fight for survival had just begun. The following days blurred into a cycle of meticulous care, whispered encouragement, and anxious waiting. Lisa, with occasional help from a dedicated Helen who insisted on doing something, maintained a round-the-clock vigil. The kittens required feeding every 2 hours, day and night, a demanding schedule Lisa managed with weary expertise. Slowly, miraculously, 3 of the 4 kittens began to respond. Their suckle reflex improved slightly, allowing Lisa to transition from tube feeding to carefully using a tiny bottle and nipple. They gained minuscule amounts of weight. Their mews grew a fraction stronger. Their movements became less feeble. One tiny orange male, the smallest of the litter, remained heartbreakingly weak. But Lisa refused to give up on him. Clementine's recovery was even slower, more perilous. She remained lethargic for several days, barely acknowledging her surroundings. Lisa continued the fluids, the antibiotics, syringing tiny amounts of high-calorie liquid food into her mouth. She kept the mother cat warm, clean, and quiet, talking to her constantly in soothing tones. Helen would often sit quietly beside Clementine's recovery crate, simply offering her presence, stroking her gently when Lisa said it was okay. Then, on the 4th day, came the first real flicker of hope for the mother cat. Lisa found Clementine attempting to groom her own front paw, a small, weak movement, but a sign of returning awareness and instinct. Later that day, she drank a little water on her own. By the end of the first week, she was taking soft food voluntarily, albeit small amounts, and her fever had subsided. The glazed look left her eyes, replaced by a dazed but present awareness. The true turning point came nearly 10 days after the rescue. Lisa placed the kittens, now stronger and nestled in a soft blanket, near Clementine's crate. The mother cat lifted her head, her ears twitching at the familiar squeaks. A low purr rumbled in her chest, the first Lisa had heard. Tentatively, Clementine reached out a paw towards the blanket bundle. Encouraged, Lisa carefully placed the strongest kitten beside her. Clementine immediately began licking it, her purr growing stronger. She nudged the kitten towards her belly. Hesitantly at first, then with more confidence, the kitten latched on and began to nurse properly. Tears streamed down Lisa's face as she watched. One by one, she placed the other two stronger kittens with Clementine, who accepted them readily, her maternal instincts finally able to fully emerge now that her own body was healing. Even the tiniest male, though still needing supplemental bottle feeding, seemed to gain comfort from snuggling against his mother and siblings. Clementine, weak as she still was, seemed revitalized by the return of her purpose. She groomed her babies obsessively, curled protectively around them, her deep purr a constant reassurance. From that point on, their recovery accelerated. With their mother's milk and devoted care, the kittens thrived. They opened their eyes, revealing shades of blue that would later turn green or gold. They grew plump, their coats becoming soft and fluffy. Soon, they were tumbling over each other, exploring their increasingly larger enclosure with wobbly determination. Clementine gained weight steadily, her orange coat regaining its healthy sheen. She remained a gentle, devoted mother, watchful and patient with her boisterous offspring. The story of the rescue and the family's survival against the odds spread through the rescue network and, via Helen and Mike, through the local community. Donations of kitten food, litter, and funds for Clementine's ongoing vet care arrived at Lisa's door. The Miracle family, as they became known, represented a beacon of hope, a testament to resilience and the power of compassion. When the kittens were old enough, finding them loving homes was easy. Their adorable faces and dramatic backstory made them highly sought after. Lisa vetted potential adopters carefully, ensuring each kitten went to a perfect forever home. Helen Dubois, deeply moved by the experience, decided she couldn't part with the smallest male kitten, the one who had struggled the most. She named him Pip, short for Pipsqueak, and prepared her quiet home for the joyful chaos he would undoubtedly bring, a living reminder of the miracle that began under her rhododendron bush. And Clementine? She had blossomed in Lisa's care, transforming from a near-death stray into a trusting, affectionate cat. While still reserved, she clearly craved security and gentle companionship. Lisa knew she deserved a quiet, loving home where she would never face hardship again. As fate would have it, a retired couple who volunteered for Lisa, known for their patience with shy cats, fell completely in love with her. Clementine went home with them to a life filled with warm beds, reliable meals, gentle hands, and the peace she so richly deserved. The dramatic rescue was complete. The miracle realized not through magic, but through fortunate timing, dedicated human intervention, and the fierce, enduring power of a mother's love and the simple will to survive. The dying ginger cat and her adorable kittens, saved from the shadows, stepped into the light of new beginnings, their survival a heartwarming testament to hope rekindled. The late afternoon sun streamed through the clean panes of the bay window, warming the plush blue velvet armchair where Clementine lay curled. Her ginger fur, once dull and patchy, now glowed with health, a soft contrast against the deep blue fabric. She wasn't asleep, but resting in that state of quiet contentment only truly secure cats seem to master. Her green eyes half closed, blinking slowly as she watched dust motes dance in the golden shafts of light. The rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall and the distant clink of teacups from the kitchen were the only sounds in the peaceful room. Arthur Jenkins entered quietly, carrying his own cup of tea, and settled into the armchair opposite hers. He was a gentleman with kind eyes and hands that moved slowly, deliberately. Perfect, Lisa had known, for a cat like Clementine who still carried faint shadows of her past trauma. "There's my pretty girl," Arthur murmured, his voice soft. "Enjoying the sunshine?" Clementine shifted slightly, acknowledging his presence with a soft, rumbling purr that vibrated through the cushions. She stretched languidly, extending her paws, claws carefully sheathed, then curled back into her comfortable position. A far cry, Arthur thought, not for the first time, from the terrified, near-feral creature Lisa had first described, let alone the dying wraith Mike had found under the rhododendron bush. She still had moments of reserve, times when a sudden noise might send her briefly under the sofa, but those moments grew fewer with each passing week. Mostly, she exuded a calm acceptance of this new life, this unexpected haven. She sought out laps now, offered gentle head boops against ankles, and greeted Arthur and his wife Carol each morning with a soft chirp. Arthur reached over and gently stroked Clementine's back, from her shoulders down to the base of her tail. Her purr intensified, a steady engine of warmth and trust. She arched slightly into his touch, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about the journey she had made. Gone was the desperate, consuming fear for survival, the frantic need to protect helpless young people in a hostile world. Here, there was only warmth, safety, the reliable presence of gentle hands, and the quiet rhythm of a peaceful home. She tilted her head back slightly, looking at Arthur with those slow, trusting blinks. It was impossible to know what memories, if any, lingered behind those intelligent green eyes. The cold dampness, the gnawing hunger, the fading cries of her kittens. But what was clear was her profound grasp of the present, the softness of the chair, the warmth of the sun, the kindness of the human beside her. For Clementine, the miracle hadn't just been survival. It had been the arrival into this quiet harbor, a place where a formerly lost and dying stray could finally, simply, be. As Arthur continued his gentle stroking, Clementine's eyes drifted fully closed. Her purr softened into the quiet breath of contented sleep, safe in the heart of her forever home.